Hey y'all, today I'm going to do some extra examples on finding the midpoint between two coordinates. So on a segment or between two given coordinates or perhaps in a polygon. So remember the midpoint is the middle of the 2 points. It's right in the middle, and one way we find a middle is to find an average. So what we need to do is identify the coordinates of these points. So this is -3, 2. And this one is 4, 4. And so we want to find the average of the x's and the average of the y's, and that will give us a midpoint. So I like to label my points x1, y1, x2, y2, just so I remember what's the x numbers and what's the y numbers. And my midpoint is going to be coordinates. And so it's going to be an average of x and an average of y. So when I find the average for x, that means I just add the x's, so -3 plus 4, and then I divide by 2 because there's two numbers. For the y's, I do 2 plus 4 and divide by 2. And again, it's helpful to identify which ones are the x's and the y's in each. So -3 plus 4 is 1, and 2 plus 4 is 6, and I just need to simplify. So I'll just leave that as 1/2, and 6 over 2 is 3. So my midpoint is at 1/2, 1, 2, 3, and you can see there I am right on the line. There's my midpoint. So I'll do the same thing here. I'm going to identify the coordinates, so -1, 2, and 1, -5. And then I'll label that this is x1 and y1, x2 and y2. And when I find my midpoint, and I'm going to write this every time, I'm going to average the x's and then average the y's. I'm going to put it in parentheses so that I remind myself midpoint is a coordinate. So it has to have an x and a y. It has to be in parentheses. My x's were -1 and 1. So I add those and divide by 2. My y's were 2 and -5. So I add those and divide by 2. I don't need an equal sign. -1 plus 1 is 0, and 0 divided by anything is 0. 2 plus -5 is -3 over 2, and there you have it. So our midpoint is at 0, -3 over 2. -3 over 2, you could write this another way. You could call it -1 and 1/2. So 0, -1 and a half is right there. That's my midpoint. It should look like it's right in the middle of those 2 points. We'll do one more. So the coordinates here are -1, 2, and -3, -5. So there's my x and my y, my x and my y. And again, midpoint says average the x's, average the y's. Remember, an average tells you where's the middle, so we need to know the middle of the x values and the middle of the y values. So my two x's are -1 and -3. We'll add those. Averaging means add them and we'll divide by 2 since there's two numbers. Then my y's are 2 and -5 plus -5. Again, we're dividing by 2 because we're adding two numbers together. So for my x, I get -4 over 2. For my y, I get -3 over 2. And then we're going to simplify that. -4 over 2 is the same as -2. And -3 over 2 is the same as -1 and a half. If you put that in your calculator, you would get -1.5, and so you can write it as that, or you can write it as -1 and a half. Same thing. So this says my midpoint is at -2, Negative 1.5, that's right there, right in the middle. And a reminder that that means that the distance from this point to the midpoint is the same as the distance from the other point to the midpoint. And so we can do the same thing even if we don't have a picture. We're just going to average the x's and average the y's. So my x's are negative 10 and negative 6, so I'll add those together. Divide by 2 because there's two numbers. There's my y's. Add those together. Divide by 2 because there's two numbers. So I get negative 16 over 2 and negative 16 over 2. And that simplifies to be negative 8, negative 8. Again, remember that your midpoint, if you're having a point requires an x and a y coordinate, and so you need to have two answers pretty much in parentheses. They look like the coordinates of a location in the coordinate plane. Again, I label my numbers so I know what's x and what's y. I'm writing down my formula, even if it's just to say average the x's and average the y's. My x's are negative 8 and negative 8. I'm adding them and dividing by 2 because there's two numbers. My y's are 8 and negative 3. I'm adding them and dividing by 2 because there's two numbers. So I get negative 16 over 2, and I get 5 over 2. And we'll simplify that and find that our midpoint is at negative 8. And then 5 over 2, you can put in your calculator, you'll get 2.5, which is the same as 2.5. So you can write it as 2.5, or you can write it as 2.5. Both are correct, both are acceptable, both mean the same thing. And this last one, again, same process, labeling my x's and my y's, sort of the same process as slope, writing my formula, or my process, if you want to call it a process, it's less of a formula. Average the x's, so 3 plus 1, divide by 2 because there's two numbers. Average the y's, 0 plus 6, divide by 2 because there's two numbers. So I get 4 over 2 and 6 over 2. And so I'll simplify 4 over 2 to be 2 and 6 over 2 to be 3. And if you want to think about it, like I said, the midpoint was in the middle. The average is the way to find the middle. So if you look at just the x's, this number 2 should be in the middle of 3 and 1. Well, it definitely is. 2 is right in the middle of 3 and 1. My y value of my midpoint 3 should be in the middle of 0 and 6. Well, 3 is right in the middle of 0 and 6. 3 is halfway to 6. So it's definitely the midpoint. So that's all I have. If you still have any questions about midpoint, make sure you get in touch with me. Stay after class and ask questions, or let me know you want to come to office hours, or send me an email. Good luck.